Welcome to China Now, your ultimate guide to understanding today's China and its place in our ever-changing world. I am Makiza Latifa, here to take you on this exciting journey every Saturday morning. Grateful for your time. Let's start off with China Current, who will be presenting to us the very latest happenings in China and trending news in the past few days. In this edition, he presents to us an editorial on the relations between China and the United States, with Biden exiting office and the start of a new administration led by President Donald Trump. Very interesting session coming right up. Please stay tuned.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
In December 2022, after winning the election, Donald Trump made a significant statement at a press conference. He said China and the United States can together solve all the problems of the world. Many people thought this meant Trump would try to work with China during his second term. However, the reality is that the United States isn't in a strong position to negotiate cooperation. Instead, it finds itself asking for China's help. The reason is simple. The U.S. national debt, which stands at $36 trillion, is the largest problem in the world right now. The United States cannot solve this issue on its own. Meanwhile, around the same time, China announced a policy that might be able to end the U.S. dollar hegemony and reshape the global economy. On the 12th of December 2024, they called for a moderately loose monetary policy. This is a significant change as China only used a similar approach after the 2008 financial crisis from 2009 to 2011. Essentially, the Chinese government plans to raise funds by issuing long-term government bonds. They intend to use these funds to upgrade China's industries and help the global economy recover from the looming U.S. national debt crisis. This strategy has been proving effective. In November 2008, the Chinese government introduced a $586 billion plan by issuing government bonds. A portion of this investment went into building high-speed rail, ports, and airports. Another part was lent to Chinese tech companies at low interest rates, particularly in new energy, telecommunication, and semiconductors. This is where China has the potential to significantly impact the U.S. economy. For example, starting in 2009, Huawei dramatically increased its research and development spending. By 2012, its research and development budget reached $4.8 billion, making up 10% of its annual revenue. That same year, Huawei launched its first smartphone, the Ascend D1, marking its entry into the global high-end smartphone market and completing its industrial upgrade. For China, Huawei's upgrade boosted its workforce from 80,000 to 140,000, with 55% of these employees working in research and development. This created new income for at least 60,000 families. Additionally, Huawei generated significant foreign exchange. In 2022, the company's global sale revenue reached $99.18 billion, which was $11 billion more than Switzerland's GDP for that year. Huawei smartphones offer similar performance to Western brands, but are often priced lower. This affordability has allowed people in developing countries to access modern communication technologies, contributing to their economic growth through the internet. By 2023, Huawei had connected 19 million people in remote areas across 80 countries to the internet for the first time. This connectivity has opened up new export opportunities for South America and Africa, even if they don't sell directly to China, as they now have stronger bargaining power with European and US retailers. Huawei has been important in helping developing countries start their own tech companies. For example, a market research firm predicts that the Philippines data center market will reach $635 million by 2027. Instead of competing directly, Huawei provided equipment to the local telecom company Coverage ICT Solutions. Huawei's network equipment is much smaller, 70% less space than competitors, which lower the retail cost in expensive Malina. This has given the company coverage a competitive advantage. By June 2023, coverage has captured 54% of the Philippines' fiber-to-home market, keeping the benefits of this growth within the country. This shows that with a loose monetary policy, China's growing tech companies have created jobs and business opportunities. They've also helped boost the global economy by reducing the digital divide around the world. At the same time, China's industrial upgrade could challenge the dominance of the US dollar. In the past, the US managed its debt crisis because the dollar was tied to oil. Developing countries had to use dollar to buy oil for manufacturing and transportation, which kept the dollar strong. However, three important industries that China is developing could eventually change this oil-dollar system. First, the key industry is electric vehicles, which greatly reduce the need for oil in transportation. In China, 50% of vehicles sold are already electric. According to the International Energy Agency, more than half of all cars worldwide will be electric by 2035. By 2023, 60% of global EVs were made in China, placing the country at the forefront of a future transportation system that doesn't rely on oil. Notably, China's top EV manufacturer, BYD, launched its first all-electric sedan, the Qing, in 2012, thanks to previous industrial upgrade in the country. The second key area is renewable energy technologies, which reduce the need for fossil fuel to generate electricity. Since 2012, China has led the world in installing solar power, fully integrating it into the electrical grid. The cost of generating electricity has dropped by 70% since then, making energy much cheaper for Chinese manufacturers. For example, in Ningxia province, 87% of solar power generated is sold in the market, with a cost of just 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. By comparison, the lowest electricity price in the US, in Louisiana, is 11.93 cents per kilowatt hour. In China, wherever the sun shines, affordable non-oil electricity is available. China is also tackling the main challenges of solar power like weather dependency and land use. On the 31st of December 2024, the country launched its first offshore solar power plant in Jiangsu province. This plant combines solar power, hydrogen production, and energy storage, generating 400 megawatts of electricity. During the day, any extra electricity is used to turn seawater into hydrogen gas. On cloudy days or at night, the stored hydrogen provides stable electricity, helping industries move away from fossil fuel. Third, China has the world's most advanced grid technology, which allows efficient transfer of wind and solar energy from remote areas to more developed regions. This means even people living far away can benefit from the green economy. China has about 1.4 billion people, with most living in the eastern coastal areas, leading to electricity shortages there. Meanwhile, the western regions have plenty of hydro and wind energy, but have low population density and are less industrialized. To solve this problem, China built a 3,000-kilometer power grid to send clean energy to the eastern provinces, using ultra-high voltage technology to minimize energy loss during transmission. This not only provides income for the western provinces, but also helps the East rely less on fossil fuel for power. Since 2009, China's steady progress in these three key areas has allowed it to produce and transport goods using much less oil. By 2023, China's industrial output made up about one-third of global production, and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization expects this share to rise to 45% by 2030. This means that if Beijing decides to stop using the US dollar, it could lead to a significant reduction in the dollar-oil system. China is also promoting this oil-free energy system around the world. Africa, for example, has great weather conditions and is ideal for developing solar power. Over the past 3 years, China's solar panel supplier Jinko Solar has delivered solar panels and energy storage system to 45 African countries. In September 2024, China completed a 100-megawatt solar power plant project in South Africa, which will provide 480 gigawatts per hour of clean energy each year, enough to power 200,000 households. In the same month, China also announced plans to build 30 additional clean energy projects across Africa. By fostering green transitions in developing countries, the world not only reduces carbon dioxide emission, but also moves towards a future less reliant on the oil dollar system. Reflecting back on China's monetary policy, 16 years has passed since 2008, during which we've witnessed the rise and flourishing of the new tech giants like Huawei, DJI, and BYD. As a result, cutting-edge technologies are becoming increasingly affordable for a broader population. Looking ahead, China envisioned that everyone will enjoy a more modern lifestyle in the next 16 years. And that is all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below, and see you next time.
We appreciate the insights you've just shared with us. Let's proceed with the Thinkers Forum, where scholars and thought leaders unpack China's role on the global stage. Today's segment is in three folds. First on the list is John Ross, a senior fellow at the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies at the Renmin University of China. Stay tuned for more as we explore fresh perspectives on the Thinkers Forum.
The reason that China's economy has slowed down is very simple. The investment has been falling significantly in China. This is hidden by the fact of what is called in economic terms gross fixed investment. That is the total level of investment. But you have to subtract from that depreciation because a certain amount of capital wears out each year. And as China's accumulated capital stock becomes bigger and bigger, the depreciation increases. So the level of investment, gross investment in the economy has remained pretty much the same, slightly over 40%. But the percentage of depreciation in the economy has gone up considerably. That means if we go back to 2007, the net investment in China's economy was about 25% of GDP, and it's now fallen to 15% of GDP. Well, if investment falls by 10%, well, then the economy is going to slow down greatly. Because you have huge confusion in the Western media, which says what from an economic point of view are completely illiterate things. For example, you read in the Western media such things as consumption accounts for 66% of GDP growth. But this is not true. Consumption always accounts for 0% of GDP growth because consumption is not an input into production. If something is an input into production, then it is by definition not consumption. What that really means is that 66% of the economy is consumed. That's correct. But the contribution of consumption to the production is always exactly zero. We don't need to look to try to measure it each year because it never contributes anything to the development of production. And therefore you have a very confused type of terminology on this. Or let's take, again, you read in the Western media, China should increase consumption. Well, this could mean two quite different things. Lurking behind these words is an ambiguity. One could be that you need to increase the living standard of the population. That means its actual consumption more rapidly. This is a very important goal. It makes a difference. If, say, people's consumption goes up by 5% a year, this is much better than if their consumption goes up by 2% a year. But the second thing it could mean is that what you have to do is increase the percentage of consumption in GDP. But that number doesn't matter at all. Nobody eats a percentage. And if you really want to have very, very high percentage of consumption in GDP, then you should look at countries like the Central African Republic or Zimbabwe or something like that, where you can have 90% of the economy is consumed. And these are amongst the poorest countries in the world. And not merely is this confused, but the two things move in opposite directions. One of the recent studies which we published was to show this, is to show that the percentage of consumption in GDP and the growth rate of consumption are negatively correlated. That means the higher the percentage of consumption in GDP, the more slowly the people's consumption is going to grow. So all these Western people are saying China should increase consumption, are actually, by which they mean China should increase the percentage of consumption in GDP, are actually going to lead to living standards growing more slowly in China, because the higher becomes the percentage of consumption in GDP, the more slowly the people's consumption will grow. This is elementary economics. You should know this, you know, after about 6 weeks of a school economics class. But you have completely illiterate economic things which appear regularly in the Western media because they can't really admit to what is the fact of the situation, which is that China has a better economic development strategy than they do. Because that would destroy, you know, myths of Western superiority, white superiority. They can't imagine it. The point, as I've made the point, is that China has not merely outperformed the Western economies materially, that is, it grows more rapidly, outthought them as well. Its economic policies are more intelligent than those of the West. I mean, let's take the ridiculous thing of the so-called Nobel Prize for Economics, which is not actually a Nobel Prize, but anyway, leave that on one side, right, okay? This should be absolutely boring. It should be only the question of which Chinese economist has won it this year. Because China, for the 40 years, has had the most rapid economic growth of any country in the whole of human history. That's not an exaggeration. That's just a fact. Did China grow with no theory? Well, if you can have the most successful economy in the world with no theory, well then all the economics departments in the world, universities, should be shut down because they're a waste of resources, because you don't need a theory in order to grow, if that case. Now, obviously China had an economic theory, has extremely sophisticated economic theories, and these are the most successful. So the only question should be which of these Chinese economists is given the Nobel Prize. So instead what you have is a ridiculous situation where people are engaged in some small field of economics in the West are given this, and the people who actually produce the practical results, which is the economists in China, don't get it. So it's a sort of mad world in which the people who are successful don't receive the prizes and the people who are unsuccessful do receive the prizes. And this is just because of, you know, Western arrogance, capitalist propaganda, whatever you want to say, but it's nuts once you begin to think about the situation. Let's look at what is the exact situation in the Chinese economy today. What is the most crucial question? I think the most crucial question is the profitability situation. This is the biggest problem. There's a lot of discussion about consumption, which is confused. The biggest objective problem is that company profitability has not increased for over 5 years. And this explains many of the trends which exist at the present time. For example, if we take last year, the increase in state investment is rather reasonable, about slightly over 6%, but private investment didn't go up at all. Why not? Because private investment only takes place when there is an increase in profitability. And if profitability is not going up, there's no reason why investment should go up. Look at the situation in the stock exchange. I know recently there was a huge boost in the stock share prices due to the government stimulus, but if we take, let's say, the last 4 or 5 years, it hasn't gone up. But there's no reason why it should. If profitability is not going up, there is no reason why the share price should go up. So therefore you have a slightly peculiar situation whereby a socialist country has to aid its private sector. But the advice which is being given by the West damages the private sector. Because what the West is saying, as say the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, etc., is that China should be increasing consumption. Well, if you increase consumption, particularly by making wages rise more rapidly than GDP, then you will cut profitability. So you've got a peculiar situation whereby the advice which is coming in from the Western media, which is to increase the percentage of consumption in GDP, is actually damaging the private sector within China. And therefore, you have a real situation in which the Chinese government needs to aid the private sector. But it's not in the way that the West says. The West says the big problem about the private sector is that it's not sure of property rights, etc. This is a lot of nonsense. Because the Chinese economy, private investment grew very rapidly for a very long time, in which you had exactly the same property rights as you have now. So that's not what's causing the problem. What's causing the problem in the economy is that the profitability is not going up. And this is what should be being discussed in the West. But the reason that it's not discussed is simple, because if you discussed that the real problem that has to be looked at is the question of profitability, then you would be led to the exactly opposite conclusion to the one that what needs to be done is to raise the percentage of consumption in GDP. So therefore, the Western debate is greatly confusing the situation. And you have it's a very paradoxical situation, that what really the private sector needs in China is the aid which is given by the socialist government, and what is damaging for the private sector in China is the advice which is being given by the West. That's a bit of a paradox, but that's the actual situation which we have. If you want to boost company profitability, the fundamental target you need to do is, I would say, that real wages should grow about 0.5% slower than the growth of GDP. What that would mean is, therefore, that resources were gradually being transferred into profitability. This would not be negative from the point of the living standards of the population, because the economy would grow more fast. And therefore, obviously, let's say, for example, if the economy grows at 3% and the real wages grow at 3%, this is not as good as, say, as if the economy grows at 6% and the real wages grow at 5.5%. What's important for people is not the percentage, it's the real increase. So what has happened is that consumption has risen in the economy, and real wages have grown faster than GDP, and this is therefore putting pressure on company profitability. And you're not going to turn around the situation of private investment. China's state sector can invest regardless of what is the level of profitability. That's why the state economy, state investment goes up. I mean, I don't advocate that. I think that the state-owned companies should be profitable, but it could do, in principle, continue to increase investment even when the profitability is not very high. But the private sector can't. The private sector will only increase its investment if its profits are going up. And therefore, there is not going to be a recovery of private investment in China until there is an increase in profitability. Similarly, while you can have short-term boosts to share prices, there will not be a sustained increase in share prices until the profitability of the companies started going up. So it's not the discussion about consumption. This is a confused discussion, utterly wrong ideas in many cases. And anyway, it's not really the central issue. The real central issue in the economy is how to revive the profitability of the companies, because that hasn't gone up for 5 years, and that's what's producing some negative trends. But we've got to be clear, China's economy is still growing at 5% a year. The US economy is growing at slightly over 2%, and Europe is growing at 1% a year. So when we talk about problems, they're relative problems. China's economy is still doing much, much better than the Western economies. That's why all this talk about peak China and economic crisis in China. Well, any Western economy would be, if it grew at 5%, it would be ecstatically pleased with the situation. So is it the case there are no problems in China's economy? No, obviously not. But these problems are far less than the problems in the Western economy. And you have to address what are the real problems, not the fake problems, which is what has been discussed. Most of the discussion, which takes place in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal or something, is completely foolish. Now, actually, this is nothing new. My main source of income was I advised companies. And I know how inaccurate the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Economist are. I made a joke to them, but which is true. I'm very grateful to the Financial Times because its inaccuracy was how I used to make money, which they didn't like as a remark, but it is absolutely true. These companies need accurate information. They don't get accurate information out of the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal. Therefore, this created a space that if you give them accurate information, you are making money out of the inaccuracy of these newspapers. And it was perfectly possible to make a living like that.
Next on the Thinkers Forum is Keyu Jin, a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science.
China's challenge is that it has shifted from the singular goal of economic development encapsulated in GDP growth as a quantifiable number to a broader set of objectives that include social objectives as well as national security objectives. And indeed, that is part of China's challenge today. But I think ultimately it is also a choice and a preference, which could differ from country to country. Now, there's the US, which is great for trailblazing innovation, but scores poorly on inequality and many of these social indicators at various levels. There's Europe, which scores higher on the social aspects, but is not meeting its potential when it comes to wealth creation and innovation. And where does China want to be? Does it want to be more on the US level of decentralized economy and innovation, but with lots of social problems, or does it want to look more like Europe? I think that is also part of China's new playbook, as my book is called, on finding that combination that suits its national characteristics. So I think this is very much ultimately a learning and a path that has to be tread. I'm more of the view that you want to unleash the wealth creation at the individual micro level. And with that wealth, there are better ways, maybe a better political system, maybe a better political mechanism to redistribute in ways that you not end up looking like many of the US problematic aspects. But absent the wealth creation, there's very little to work with, because I think the lesson from the Chinese people in the last 40 years is that they're so grateful to reforms, they're so grateful to economic progress. That's actually what they're most thankful for. And yes, it can create some turbulence along the way, some bumpy path, and some massive wealth gathered in the few individuals. Well, because China's a very large country, and it's almost indicative of meritocracy, where you have a good idea and you become an overnight billionaire. That's achieved by many in China. But how to tackle the unfair aspects of inequality is something they can do. China does not have the lobbying system of the US, which also creates a huge amount of inequity and unfair and unjust outcomes. It can prevent that, but it should not give up the pro-growth agenda, should not give up the huge dream and reality that China is one of the few places in the world where you can actually create massive amounts of wealth. The US is already at some level of steady state, and their improvements are not orders of degrees of magnitude different from the past, but a slow, gradual improvement. And there, you debate about policies, the restrictions on what one can do. But finally, I think the one difference really is that Chinese government has a longer vision, or can afford a longer horizon vision. In not all, but many aspects of China, the nation's development. They think in 20 years, they think in 30 years, because there's continuity. There's continuity of policy. There's not going to be this pendulum swing and disruptions. And there's not going to be this intention to kind of deliberately change course from the previous government because they're party politics or party competition. There is, on most things, continuity. But if there needed to be a radical change, there is at least political scope to do it. Whether they do it or not is a different matter, but it could be potentially more easily implemented. Sometimes it is an advantage that you can implement strategically important policies without too much political debate and too much political constraint. China is a rapidly changing economy, but it's more subtle than just being able to change policy quickly. It is that they can start a policy or reform or a radical idea, really, in one small place in China. If that fails, then we'll just chuck it. If it actually is successful, then they're gradually, rolled out in 5 provinces, 10 provinces, and then throughout the country. And that was how reform was implemented. That was how reform was successful. It was not an overnight change, as in the case of many other transitional countries like Eastern Europe, because you didn't know whether these policies would be successful or not, what kind of unexpected consequences they would lead. But China pursued a gradual reform policy development strategy. And even today, we see that when there are important paradigm shifts or that's needed, then they shift once they've made up the mind. And this can, avoid some of the longer traps. The Chinese government has a major dilemma. that the US corresponding policymakers do not face, which is in today's circumstances, how can you stimulate growth without blowing up the debt again, right? That's the main challenge. And that's why they're being very deliberate and more careful about the approach, because after 2015, the main objective of the policymakers, central bank, and so forth, is to cool down an economy that's very easily heated up and very difficult to cool down. That was the main objective, and hence the monetary tightening that followed. Today, the main objective is to heat up an economy that is difficult to heat up, but remains very cool. But how can you do that without, again, placing huge amount of debt impositions and challenges on the local government? I think that's why they're being cautious. And the second reason they're being deliberate and cautious is that it's not clear what exactly works most efficiently and most effectively. And there are many different kind of tools. There could be a coordination between fiscal and monetary policy. It could be about the real estate property developers, or it could be about directly stimulating the consumers or service sector. There are really an infinite combination of policy tools. The key question is, how is it going to trickle to the real economy rather than just liquidity kind of being bottled into the financial system and much of that just used to reduce local government debt rather than going into the real economy. I think that's also part of the challenge. And on the conceptual level, there is one big difference, which is that the Chinese government believes that unless you have sustainable wage increases in the long term, the Chinese people will not consume based on a short-term stimulus, like the hand-to-mouth checks in the US or the short-term kind of what do they call it? Revenge spending or that kind of phenomenon is not going to pertain to the Chinese people unless they see longer term sustainable changes in their living standards. Now, I still believe that there are ways to get around these challenges, and I do believe that some of the Keynesian effects could work. It's just that the Chinese government and many other governments, actually, apart from the UK and US governments, very few governments are very keen to do large Keynesian type of stimulus, and that's just a mentality difference.
And wrapping up on today's segment of the show is our third guest on the Thinkers Forum, Ron Unz, an American theoretical physicist, publisher, and founder of the Unz Review. Stay with us for more details because you won't want to miss this.
In the last 20 or 30 years, really 40 years, there's been a tremendous polarization of wealth in the United States. In other words, most ordinary Americans have shown little, if any, economic improvement in 30 or 40 years, which is unprecedented in American society. In other words, for hundreds of years, Americans had always been more prosperous than their parents, more prosperous than the grandparents. And that stopped about 30 or 40 years ago. So Americans these days, in many cases, are poorer than their parents were. They're poorer than their grandparents were, and are certainly not growing, not doing well economically anymore. While on the other hand, the tiny elite wealthy class of American society, the top 1%, the top 2%, maybe the top 5%, is getting incredibly wealthy by comparison. And there's a widespread feeling that much of that wealth has been acquired parasitically. In other words, it's basically that a tiny section of the American public has been getting much wealthier by really extracting wealth from the rest of the country and making the rest of the country much poorer, which, is the sort of thing that in many countries in the last hundreds of years has led to a revolution. In other words, when you have a tiny elite getting wealthier and wealthier, and the bulk of the population doing worse and worse over time, at some point things might boil over and you might see basically, a violent clash. And so the fact that, that particular executive was assassinated by somebody, outraged over the wealth that he and his company were extracting from the American public. I mean, that's a very dangerous indicator because, the fact that so much of the American public endorsed what he was doing. I mean, there's such a tremendous dissatisfaction over a lot of these corporations, with the healthcare sector being a perfect example of it. In other words, we're talking about basically, I think America spends something like 17 or 18% of its entire GDP on healthcare. And we have some of the worst healthcare results in the world. In other words, the average Chinese person lives longer than the average American. I mean, America is still a much wealthier country, but the Chinese life expectancy is now longer. And, Chinese are much healthier than Americans. They're doing much better than Americans. And the same thing is certainly true of America's European allies. In other words, if you look at, for example, a chart showing the amount of money America is spending on healthcare and the life expectancy, we're diverging from all of our European allies. And so, if we're spending all of this money and we're not getting any results for it, and, ordinary people are sometimes driven into bankruptcy or destroyed economically because their health insurance provider refused to cover the cost of their, services. I mean, that makes people very, very angry. And, I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg. When you look at, for example, the health problems in the United States, obesity is a gigantic problem. Much of it caused probably because of the lobbying of corporations to encourage the government to support, eating certain food products rather than other food products. And so we're talking about an incredibly corrupt society. I mean, in other words, you know, when you're talking about micro corruption, in other words, in most parts of the United States, if you get a ticket from the police, you can't bribe the police. If you try that, you'll go to prison. If you try doing, for example, you can't bribe people about zoning permits. America has very little micro corruption, but it has gigantic macro corruption. Corruption on the topmost level, corruption, on, for example, the national security level, with so much of our money going to these defense contractors who, in a sense, are paying off the government official. I mean, right now, America's spending probably $1 trillion a year on defense, and we can't build artillery shells. We don't have the industrial capacity to build artillery shells. I mean, our planes, we're talking about planes that don't fly very well. The F-35 has all sorts of problems, and we've spent $1 trillion a year on defense. So, I mean, that's a perfect example of why, I'm talking about macro corruption. In other words, we're talking about huge sectors of the American economy, the healthcare sector, the defense sector, that are almost entirely controlled by the private enterprises that profit from them and, in effect, control those sectors of the government that are designed to regulate or control them. And so, that's why people are more and more dissatisfied. So much money being spent. I mean, we have gigantic budget deficits, gigantic trade deficits. I mean, there's a very good chance that the dollar in the American economy might collapse in the foreseeable future. I mean, we're talking about a situation that I think is eerily reminiscent of what America was going through right before the financial collapse of 2008. I think China, Europe, the rest of the world regarded America as having exactly the right financial system to follow. In other words, we were booming, our economy was booming, we had very low employment, very low problems with the economy. In other words, we were doing very well. And it was just a house of mirrors. In other words, basically, a lot of these financial securities that we were issuing, the mortgage-backed securities, basically were houses of cards, and they all collapsed. In other words, we damaged the world economy tremendously because of our financial collapse. And after that, I think China and many other countries in the world became much more cautious about accepting American advice. I would look at, for example, the whole notion of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin now, I think it's up to like $1 trillion or $2 trillion of market value. It's basically, by most reasonable standards, it's a Ponzi scheme. In other words, it has no intrinsic value. The only reason it's considered valuable is that people are trading it back and forth. And some people have certainly become incredibly wealthy by trading Bitcoin, but it has no underlying value. And it absorbs tremendous amounts of energy from the United States and the rest of the world in terms of processing Bitcoins, mining Bitcoin. And at some point, the whole thing might suddenly collapse, which probably would cause a very deep recession in the United States. And so, that's the problem. In other words, if all these people who have been trading meme stocks that have no value, who've been trading, for example, stocks that are driven a stock market bubble, who've been basically trading Bitcoin with each other, if suddenly they lose all of their financial assets, America might see tremendous social upheaval of a sort we haven't seen for generations before. In a sense, I think there's a good deal of possibility that America is in what might classically be called a pre-revolutionary situation. In other words, there's such tremendous dissatisfaction across the country, dissatisfaction that's been spread for 10 or 20 years. I mean, and, again, more and more people are so suspicious of events of the past. And, it's because people basically don't believe the government acts in their own interests. They don't believe the government is honest. And that's why they voted for Donald Trump. I mean, they voted for Donald Trump in some cases because they supported Donald Trump, but in many other cases because they hated the enemies of Donald Trump, the American establishment. And that's why if Donald Trump is much less successful than many of them hope, if he ends up going back on many of his promises, if he ends up doing things that they feel betray them one more time, that might be the final straw. And then there really might be, sort of dramatic changes in American society that happen only very rarely in the country. Because, I mean, so many American people are just so incredibly fed up with so many things that have happened over the last 5 or 10 or 20 years that, it's not a healthy situation for our society.
And that's it for this week's edition of China Now. Thank you for joining us as we explore the stories, ideas, and insights shaping China and its connections to the world. We'll come your way same time next Saturday morning with trending stories with Lisa on China currents and inspiring conversations on the Thinkers Forum. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to tune in next Saturday morning for more stories, ideas, and perspectives from China and beyond. Until then, I'm Makiza Latifa wishing you a great week ahead. And as I always say, let China not be far away from you anymore.